couple of years ago, there was a pastor who wanted to preach through a book of the Old Testament, and he started by just making a joke, expecting some laughs. He asked his congregation to open up at the book of Moses. What surprised him was that he didn't hear any laughs. Instead, he heard pages turning, to his own shock and dismay. And so this morning, I'll ask you to open up at the book of Genesis, which is a much easier book to find than the book of Moses. And while you're paging there, allow me just to read for us two passages from the New Testament. Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So let me start by emphasizing the importance of the book that we are studying starting today. Genesis is the book of beginnings. It's the book of beginnings, not just only of creation, which we will look at today, but it is the beginning of life. It is the beginning of the institution of marriage. It is the beginning of family. It is the beginning of nations, of governments, of covenants, of promises, and yes, even sin and death. Chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis is what our theologians call protology. Protology simply means the study of first things. If you joined us in the evenings, you'd have noticed that the study of the last things, the end times, is eschatology. And so one theologian said, the study of protology is of the utmost importance, because if we get the first things wrong, how can we expect to get the last things right? And so right off the bat, I want to inform you that this series is not going to be an apologetic series, meaning that this series is not going to be a series aimed at defending the Christian faith. Apologetics is giving a defense of the faith. This series is not aimed at unbelievers, but at believers. The goal of this morning sermon and the following sermons is to help you better understand Genesis and to help you glorify God through the teachings and application from Genesis with regards to this morning then, the creation account. Unfortunately, we will not be able to go through every verse by verse, but we will be focusing on the first 2 chapters for the next 3 sermons in this series. And so, the book of Genesis, like many other passages, especially Genesis chapter 1, has a variety of interpretive approaches. And for the sake of time, I won't go through them. I will simply mention them. For example, some suggest that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 is allegory. What they mean is that it's only pictures and symbols and imagery that is used, and we are not to take the structure and the words and the order in which it is written too seriously. That is what they would suggest. This is wrong, and I'll tell you in a moment why. Some say that Genesis is simply an account of a myth. It's a myth. They claim, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, that Genesis, the creation account in chapter 1 and 2, is just a copy of many of the other creation myths that we see in the ancient Middle East. I'm sure some of you have heard this. For example, there's a very famous ancient Middle Eastern creation myth called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you read it, it's very entertaining. It's a very fascinating story. I think it would make a good Netflix show, but it's not at all anything like the Genesis account, as some have claimed. Those who say that Genesis is a knockoff of these mythical creation accounts have either never read those accounts or they have never read Genesis, because they are nothing alike. In fact, the biblical creational account is a direct attack on those ancient creation myths that would have circulated in the time of Moses. There's a very famous theologian, and I'm sure many of you maybe even listened to him, William Lane Craig. He's an apologist and a very famous debater. He recently wrote a book in which he argues that Genesis 1 to 11 should be seen as what he calls historical myth. He has received a lot of criticism for this, and rightly so. He does this, and the reason he sees Genesis as historical myth is he's trying to redeem the Genesis creation account in light of the theory of evolution. The same is true for many other people who interpret Genesis 1 and 2, the 6 days of creation, in different ways apart from as what it plainly teaches us just by reading it. Some would say that Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation, refers symbolically to 6 different ages of the earth, or different stages of the earth's existence. For example, they would say that each day is 1 million, if not hundreds of millions of years old. We will examine the text shortly now, Genesis 1, and then hopefully you'll see that's not the case, and there's many reasons why that cannot be the case. But the reason these Christians try to reinterpret Genesis chapter 1 is because, as mentioned, they are trying to redeem the Bible in light of the theory of evolution and many other secular theories. And so while we are on the topic of the theory of evolution, let's just briefly discuss it along with what is mostly believed as and called the Big Bang theory. I will only do this briefly because my focus is definitely not debating that, but to get into Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And so, I do not believe in the theory of evolution. And I'm pretty sure that's not surprising to many of you. But the reason I do not believe in the theory of evolution, that itself might be surprising to you. My belief about, or lack of belief in the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory is not necessarily because the Bible teaches against it or says something that is the opposite. Because in fact, the Bible doesn't explicitly mention anything about evolution or what the secularist interpretation of the Big Bang. No, the primary reason I do not believe in the theory of evolution is specifically because science itself disproves it. You see, the battle is not science versus religion, as some have made it out to be. It's not faith versus facts. No, the issue is with the science itself. You see, just because someone says, science says, doesn't make it right. It's the equivalent of saying, well, the Bible says, without being able to point to a chapter and a verse. To give you some example, doctors and scientists, as recently as 60 years ago, endorsed smoking as a benefit to health and fitness. Doctors and scientists, up until about 45 years ago, suggested that mercury ingestion was a way to fight cancer. In my lifetime, when I was a child, many studies were done showing that eggs that you can eat and cook with your bacon, eggs, was an unnatural amount of consumption of cholesterol when eating it, only then later to be disproven. For example, another instance is our culture's obsession with fat-free. Fat was demonized while sugar and the studies on sugar was silenced. You'd go to a store and you'd see an advertisement that says fat-free muffins. It's a muffin, obviously it's fat-free. But the studies are so paid for and influenced to focus on one specific thing and often to look away from something else. And so the issue is not necessarily science, but what is the agenda that is being pushed. If you want to know whether a scientific article or journal can be trusted, the way you can do it is quite easy. Just take a look at who funded the studies. Because of science, and I mean true science. And what is science? Science is finding the truth of the material universe, or looking for patterns within the material universe, trying to understand how it all works. True science is based on facts. And the Bible and science, true science, will never contradict each other. Never. Because creation will always glorify God. Always. For example, within the scientific community, this is first grade science, okay? If you're a scientist, this is elementary for you. Is this law of thermodynamics. Big word, thermodynamics. Within the laws of thermodynamics, there's this law that we call the law of entropy. The law of entropy, just very briefly defined, is that left to itself, a system will always move from order to disorder and never the other way around. Left to itself, a system will always move from order to disorder, not the other way around. If I take a top or one of those spinning play toys and I spin it on the ground, it's impossible for the toy to start spinning faster on its own or retain its balance on its own. The law of entropy will apply to it, meaning over a progression of time, it will start spinning slower, eventually until it loses its balance and it becomes not functional. And this the same is true if you just look around us. Trees, humans, life, animals, we don't keep on changing to becoming something better than we were. If you don't believe me, just ask the old person next to you. All of us degrade because of the law of entropy. A system left to itself always moves from order to disorder. But you see, the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory suggests the exact opposite. That the system of the universe that we see, the observable universe, as we see, is busy decaying. Stars are burning out and collapsing upon themselves. Galaxies are expanding ever further away from each other. But the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory suggests the opposite. That within the system, somehow things got to a point until everything built itself. It's the equivalent of taking a bunch of watches, let's say 10 watches, dismantling them piece by piece, every single screw, taking it out, every pointer, every single small piece, dismantling it, throwing it all in a bag, and shaking that bag until at least one watch is fully formed. It's impossible. And yet, that's what is being claimed with regards to life and the universe as it currently exists. You see, when we talk about evolution, we must be very careful with how we define our terms. For example, evolution is true on a micro scale, but is untrue on a macro scale. For example, a species changes and adapts when left unaltered in a new environment. We see this, for example, when Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands and he saw the finches, the birds. And it's a series of islands that are disconnected, but he realized that the species of finch, their beak evolved depending on the different island that they were placed at, because the food source was different. And so Darwin took that microevolution and then interpreted it as truth for macroevolution. Not where one species adapts to its environment, but where one species becomes a completely new species. For example, a fish becoming a land-dwelling mammal, and a land-dwelling mammal becoming a bird. There is no evidence for this. There is no evidence in the historical record for this. You will often hear scientists speak of the missing link. And it's sort of a euphemism, because it's not a missing link, it's a whole missing chain. What they're referring to is, we look at the historical record and we see fossils and skeletons, and we see these different species. But what they're saying is, what we're missing the in-between stages, where the fish grew legs and started breathing air, and then all of a sudden it was a land mammal. So we have the fish skeleton and we have the land mammal skeleton. We just haven't found these in-between stages yet, which according to them spans over millions, hundreds of millions of years. That's what they call the missing link. And so the theory of evolution is built on a bunch of gaps. And notice this, it's the theory of evolution. It's the theory, just like it's the Big Bang theory. But then evolutionists will argue, and they'll go into our biology, and they'll say, look at our DNA, for example, the thing that makes up our very existence, material existence. They say, look at the DNA. we share DNA with chimpanzees and some other primates. And then again, we have to be careful of how we use our words, because we do not share DNA with chimpanzees, we share a pattern of DNA. But we also share a pattern of DNA with the fruit fly. Does that mean that we are somehow descended from chimpanzees and fruit flies? No, not even the evolutionists claim that. Yet, there's a similar pattern. Clouds and cucumbers both consist of 98% water. Yet no one will assume that they are somehow related. And I know that is a very lacking analogy, but what I'm trying to get over is that correlation does not mean causation. Correlation does not mean causation. And so quickly, just then on the Big Bang Theory, or before we move to the Big Bang Theory, let me just share some sources with you. This is a book written by Stephen Meyer. He's an extremely intelligent researcher, computer scientist, and ethics student. I can't remember the full title. He wrote a book where he critically analyzes and critiques the theory of evolution, Darwinian evolution. And just on a side note, this guy is not a believer, okay? There isn't some Christian or deistic, theistic agenda. A critique that one person wrote, another scientist who reviewed his book said, Stephen Meyer's thoughtful and meticulous book, Darwin's Doubt, convinced me that Darwin has failed. The Deniable Darwin and other essays, the book by David Berlinski, is also essential. Once again, the person who gave the review, not a Christian. A quote from the book: there is no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances. Changes to our fur density or to wing style or beak shape. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether he can explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of species, but the emergence of new ones. Again, Darwinian evolution is a gradual step-by-step. Yet, in the Cambrian explosion of around 500 million years ago, a striking variety of new organisms, including the first ever animals, pop up suddenly in the fossil record over a mere 70-odd million years ago. And so once again, notice this isn't a believer. This is someone who simply is critiquing the theory of evolution. And what's referring to there as the Cambrian explosion is when all of a sudden, if you dig down into the Earth's layer and you get to the different you go through the different stratas of the Earth's layer, at one specific strata, there is a massive amount of fossils and skeletons that can be discovered, and that's called the Cambrian explosion. And so what he's suggesting here is that the only thing we see is that at one stage there was a massive surgence in life, and then that life was covered by the soil, and that's it. Just because we see that, now all of a sudden evolutionists start making these assumptions and drawing these theories about this is the first layer, but then later, for example, these were the first animals that evolved to later animals. But it's interesting because in some of these stratas where, for example, you'd see a fossil, a dinosaur fossil in one of these stratas, they'll, just in another place of the world, in the same strata layer, you'll get a fossil of a horse. But according to evolutionists, horses and dinosaurs could never have coexisted with each other. And so, not to spend too much time on that, let's continue. Let's quickly look at the Big Bang Theory. Just here, over 1,000, this was an essay written in 2019. It's exponentially been signed, increasingly more and more, where within the scientific community, once again, the scientific community, the secular science, there's this divide where they are openly challenging the mainstream idea of Darwinian evolution, where scientists more and more are proposing other theories. It's still secular, but the Darwinian theory of evolution is no longer becoming the mainstream. Just some interesting things about this concept of dinosaurs having lived hundreds of millions of years ago. More and more recently, they're making new discoveries about dinosaurs, not just in terms of fossils, but for example, mummified dinosaur skin, as you can see. They also have recently discovered dinosaur bones with soft tissue still within and onto the bone, and from which they can remove traces of blood to do testing on. Also, there's this 80-million-year-old dinosaur fossil that still has its soft retina eye attached to it. If you know anything about the decaying of a body, the eye is normally the first thing that decays. And so, if you leave something out there for 10 years, never mind 100 years, never mind 80 million years, the chance that the retina would still be intact is not possible at all. And so these are not Christian journals, these are secular scientific discoveries. Just some quotes from the secular community. One person writes, "An interdisciplinary approach to understanding how large organic molecules such as protein and DNA could be preserved over time suggests that even if a fossil were kept at freezing point of water, it should still decay away and become undetectable in less than 3 million years." So even the scientific community is not understanding the discoveries that they're making. They're completely puzzled about how organic dinosaur matter could be found. And then if you're interested afterwards, you can just check the video or ask me for the sources for some more of these articles. And so just quickly then on the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is already being replaced by a multitude of other theories within the secular community. The Big Bang Theory by the mainstream media is still upheld as the primary means by which secularists believe the universe came into being. And it's interesting for me that they still use the word universe, because think about that word, universe, single verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's where it comes from. And so the Big Bang Theory itself is already being replaced by a multitude of other theories because scientists are becoming more and more opposed to the obvious flaws of the theory. For example, a theory that is now becoming very popular in the scientific community is this theory called eternal matter or eternal universe. So what they're suggesting is they are starting to realize how silly it sounds to say that everything came out of nothing. And so now they change the theory by saying that matter and the universe simply always existed. The eternal universe theory. And simply, so what they're saying is they are believing the exact same thing that the ancient pagans believed, because the ancient pagans also believed that the universe and the world always existed. And so you see science, secular science, not true science, is almost back to where it came from. Some would say, well, look at our earth. We can measure things like stone and mountain and do certain tests on them, and then we can see that for these stones or mountains or boulders or trees or fossils to have existed, it means that they should have existed for millions of years if possible. There's a big flaw in this, and I'll just quickly mention this argument from a biblical point of view. When God created Adam, did he create Adam as a baby and nurtured him to manhood? No, he created him as a living man, and the same with Eve. And so if God was able to create Adam and Eve into maturity, it's definitely the case then that all of the universe was created into maturity. Some say, and it's true, that light from stars will take millions of years to reach the earth. And so if we see the stars in the night sky, it means the earth must be millions of years old because the light takes millions of years to travel to us. Again, God is able and was able to create a mature universe, just like he was able to create mature animals and mammals and sea creatures and Adam and Eve. And so it poses no challenge to the biblical point of view. Another theory that's becoming very famous is what we call the theory of the multiverse. I'm pretty sure all of you have seen this in sci-fi movies, but the scientific community is actually very interested in the multiverse. One scientist, and I quote, he says, "The multiverse may explain the observation of seemingly intelligent design." So he looks at the universe and they see it makes no sense that the universe is just random. It had to have an intelligent designer. And so now they made up the theory of the multiverse, which is very complex, but you can go and read that up on your own. And so now the multiverse, they say, could give explanation to the seemingly intelligent design. And so what I'm trying to say is this. There is not a unanimous consensus on these theories, even within the scientific community. There is no reason why, there is a reason why these are called theories and not facts. But ask yourself, why are these theories consistently being pushed into our world as a scientific fact? You get it in textbooks. If you dispute the theory, you are unintellectual. You are a fool. But yet it's still a theory because it cannot be proven. Our church father Augustine, he wrote a literal commentary on Genesis more than 1,600 years ago. And in his commentary, he writes about the creation account in Genesis 1. He says, I fear that I will be laughed at by those who have a scientific knowledge of these matters. You see, the attack on the Christian faith, the attack on creation in Genesis 1, it's not new. It's always existed. Always. Our church fathers had to deal with this. And so do we. And like them, we have to stand strong and firm. And so, quickly, what are the implications of these theories? And so we've just quickly debunked, on a very superficial, basic level, these two major theories that the whole academic world is governed by. But let's look at the implications. Let's say, hypothetically, the theory of evolution is true. What are the implications then? Well, the first implication is that no one is worth anything. We are all animals. That's it. What gives you worth is simply what you contribute to society. Survival of the fittest, right? If evolution is true, Hitler was right. Because Hitler looked at society and he said, we need to get rid of those who cannot contribute to society. They are parasites to society. Let's get rid of them. It is better for society. It is for the greater good. If evolution is true, that is the right thing to do. If evolution is true, we have a basis for racism. If evolution is true, we have a basis for racism. In fact, evolution was historically pushed by imperialists to justify their colonization and conquest because they saw themselves as the more advanced, superior race. If evolution is true, it means natural selection is true. Natural selection simply being that the best of the species will continue and those who are weak within the species will die off. If evolution is true, natural selection is not only true, it becomes our duty because we must do what is best for our species. We cannot afford people to be spreading their infirmities and their weaknesses into the human race as we continue into the future. It is our duty to eliminate them for the greater good of the species. If evolution is true, there cannot be any morality. Have you ever seen a lion apologize to his prey? No, because a lion does what the lion does. And if evolution is true, the same is true for us. The Big Bang, if it's true, the implications, it means there's no meaning to life. Everything is random. This is a mistake. We are a mistake. We are a hiccup in the existence of uncountable, unfathomable amount of time and years. If Big Bang is true, it means we have no hope. There's no hope or future. Because eventually, as those who hold to this theory observe, the universe will keep on expanding up to a point where all the stars in it burns out, light fades, energy dissipates, and life within the universe can no longer exist. Very nihilistic, right? Well, that's being taught to our children in every single public school. That's what they're being taught. But enough of this. Let's get into Genesis. Psalm 19 starts with the words, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky displays his handiwork. And so, let's take a quick look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Right off the bat, I want to say that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 is masterfully written. I'm afraid that we have become so used to Genesis chapter 1 and 2 that we just read it by muscle memory and we don't stop to examine and look at the beauty. We don't stop to ask it questions anymore because we know it, right? We know the story. But Genesis 1 and 2 is masterfully written. John MacArthur says, and quickly going back to those who claim that Genesis 1 and 2 is allegory or myth, it's in fact not, it's history. John MacArthur says, if we do not treat Genesis 1 as historical record, at which point do we begin to do that with the rest of the Bible? If you claim that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is myth or allegory, when do you switch over? Then it's a matter of opinion, a matter of your opinion. Why could Adam and Eve not then just be an allegory or a myth? Or Noah as well, even Abraham. The nation of Israel, they just made up these allegories. Well, Jesus himself, let's go into the New Testament. It's all myth and allegory. If you decide that some part is an allegory or a myth and not real and another part not, you are putting yourself over Scripture. We make an awful mistake if we take this text not to mean what it says it means. It's history. But I would like to add, as William Lane Craig suggested that Genesis chapter 1 to 11 he calls historical myth, I want to suggest that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 should be called poetic history. Poetic. It is true history, but history written in a poetic fashion. Let me explain to you. If we simply then just take Genesis chapter 1 and 2 as pure history from a textbook, we are doing this passage a massive disservice. Because Genesis chapter 1 to 3 in Hebrew is written as poetry. I would suggest calling it poetic history. In fact, our English and Afrikaans translations, they focus so much on interpreting every single word as best as they can that almost no attempt is made to carry over the poetic elements of the text. And it's a very difficult thing to do. Carrying poetry from one language over to another is not just something you do in your afternoon. A translation I would suggest to you is a translation by a man named Robert Alter. It's the Robert Alter translation. He is the foremost Hebrew scholar, biblical Hebrew scholar, and he did his PhD in English literature. And his translation, he did his best, not just to translate the Hebrew Bible, but to bring those poetic elements over. And I'll give you an example of this later. Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 was originally written for the Israelites by Moses. Genesis chapter 1 was written for the Israelites by Moses. Genesis chapter 1 is written primarily to attack polytheism, the belief in many different gods, not evolution or the Big Bang. So if you use Genesis chapter 1 as primary means to attack the Big Bang theory or evolutionist, you're doing the passage a disservice, because that's not what the original recipients would have done with the book, and that's not what it was for. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is not meant to be a hammer with which we club unbelievers to death or to conversion, whichever one may come first. But Genesis chapter 1 is given to us to teach us about God and about ourselves. The Bible, if we read, and we'll jump into the text now, notice this. If we read Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, what's the one thing you notice? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Do you notice there's an assumption in that passage, in that first verse? What is the assumptions? Well, the assumption is the existence of God. In Genesis, nowhere in the Bible does it argue for the existence of God. No defense is given, no arguments made. It assumes the existence of God. In the beginning, God. Psalm 14 verse 1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." You often wonder why atheists are so angry at the God they say they don't believe in. It's because they know there is a God. It's written, it's in their hearts. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. In fact, it's God who does not believe in atheists. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is a contrast to all other creation accounts during the time of the ancient Middle East. A common thing that we see when we read ancient Middle Eastern creation myths is this fight between the gods and what is called the chaos monster, where the gods fight the chaos monster, and after defeating him, they create the land from his skin and the sky from his skull, and people are made from his blood. We don't see that in Genesis. There's no epic fight between the gods and the chaos monster. It's simply God speaking existence into being. And that's it. And so Genesis chapter 1 teaches us two primary things about God, or teaches us two primary things. The first one is that God always was, and the second is that everything else had an origin. God always was, and everything else had an origin. You see, in Genesis chapter 1, when we will look at it, we'll see God is extremely creative. We learn so much about God. But the first thing we learn about God is in verse 1, when He created the heavens and the earth. That Hebrew word for created is so beautiful, bara. It's only ever used in relation to God. There are many different Hebrew words that assume or point to creation, but only this Hebrew word is ever used in relation to God. And it means to create out of nothing. That is what it means. In fact, the same word, this is for free, in Psalm 51, when David says, create in me a clean heart, that same word is used. Lord, supernaturally put in me a heart that loves you. And so in Latin we have this phrase that's very famous. It's called ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. Creation was ex nihilo. Creation was made out of nothing. This shows us the immense power of God. One day, there's this joke that was told where one day when Jesus came back, He decided to have a confrontation, hypothetically, with the scientist. And He challenged them to make life. And the first thing they do is they started collecting DNA and ground and different samples. And then Jesus took it away from them and He said, no, this is mine. I created this. You create life. See, God made everything out of nothing. He didn't use a fundamental material. He didn't use anything else. There was nothing, and then there was everything. Our minds cannot even comprehend that. I mean, think about this. If I ask you this question, in your mind, picture nothing. What do you see? Do you see vast blackness? Because that's still something. How does nothing look like? We don't know. It's outside our framework of perception and understanding. It's like asking you to think of a color that has never existed before. We cannot. It's impossible. But God, He created everything out of nothing. And so, Genesis chapter 1 has a lot of poetic style to it. And let's make some quick observations. We won't be able to look at everything, but just some of my favorite observations. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Those two words, formless and void, in Hebrew is tohu wabohu. Do you see the rhyme? Do you hear it? And that's intentional. And a lot of that happens in Hebrew, where if you read it out loud, you start hearing a rhythm and a pattern, and that's intentional. It means, and this phrase, tohu wabohu, formless and void, it only occurs here and in two other passages in the Old Testament, which both refer to the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. It's a play on words. For example, when we say knickknacks or chuff chuff or done and dusted, it's just a poetic expression that is lost in our translations. Robert Alter, in his translation, did his best to bring this across, and he translated formless and void as welter and waste, to try his best to bring over that beautiful poetic style. Another thing we see in this verse is the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. This hovering, that word that is used, is also used in the context of a bird who gathers her chicks beneath her to keep them warm and safe and to protect them from the weather. And so this hovering, it's not just God was there hovering like a spacecraft over the waters of the earth. No, it's like a bird who cuddles her chicks beneath her. God was in essence cuddling the planet. It shows his closeness and his intimacy. He is personally and intimately involved in his creation. He's not distant, barking off orders and everything happens. He's close to it. He cuddles it. He hovers over it. He keeps it close. Like in Isaiah where it says, an eagle who hovers, who keeps close her chicks beneath her. It's so beautiful. This shows us God's intimate involvement and relationship with his creation. Another poetic style is what is called what we read as the Spirit of God. It was the Spirit of God that was hovering. That word for spirit, very interestingly, it can be translated as both breath and spirit. Both translations would be correct. And some have now went into debate on which one should be used here according to the context. And I think personally that that word that is used there is used intentionally, because we see the Spirit of God hovering. Hovering implies personal presence. But then also, what happens in the following verse 3? And God said. He spoke. There was breath. And it just shows the poetic beauty within Genesis chapter 1, where it's not just the Spirit of God who is close with his relationship, but the breath of God who creates everything that comes into being. It's a play on words. Another poetic style that we see is this idea, or what we read in verse 3 about light. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. Verse 3, we have the first recorded words in all of existence. And it makes sense, right? Because God is the first and he is the last. Also, it makes sense that the first thing that God creates or brings into existence is light. Because what do we know of God? God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Richard Dawkins, famed militant atheist, said, religion is a fairy tale for those who are afraid of the dark. John Lennox responded by saying that atheism is for people who are afraid of the light. We see the same usage and the same beauty borrowed in the Gospel of John. If we quickly turn to the Gospel of John, John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, John borrows a lot from the creation account in Genesis. He begins in the same way. John chapter 1 verse 1, in the beginning. Just like Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 starts. John is clearly drawing. He's trying to say that in the beginning was Jesus. He was the Word. But he doesn't just stay there. He goes on. He refers to this light as Jesus, as God becoming a man. God now taking part in his physical creation by putting humanity onto himself. John chapter 1 verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, that all may believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. You see the parallels between that and Genesis chapter 1. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The beauty that we see there. So it makes sense that the very first thing that God does is he creates light. Also, John 3 verse 19, Jesus speaks. He says, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. But also, if we go to Revelation chapter 21, verse 23, what's the one thing we read there? When the new heavens and the new earth is created, there will be no sun and moon, because God himself will be the light. And so we see the Bible begin with God as the light and end with God as the light. It's perfect. I cannot think of literature that's more beautifully written than this. Also, you will notice that this chapter 1 verse 3, where God creates light, let there be light, this is done before God even creates the sun and the moon. When does God create the sun and the moon? On day 4. And the reason this is done is to show us the magnificence of God. Another reason is that in those days, the days of Moses, the sun and the moon were considered deities, gods in and of themselves by all religions, from China all the way to the Native Americans. All of them considered the sun and the moon as gods, as deities. And so now here God comes into the scene and he says, before those things even were, I was the light that came. Also, you'll notice, and I'm jumping a bit ahead, but I'm getting so excited. In day chapter, when God creates the sun and the moon, he says, day 4. On day 4, when he creates the sun and the moon and the stars, it doesn't explicitly mention the sun and the moon and the stars. It just says the greater light and the lesser light. And the reason for that is, it's on purpose. God doesn't want to even give any credit to these sun and moon deities, because their names, just the name of the sun and the moon, is associated with these other gods. So the Bible just gives a sort of like an uppercut jab to this polytheistic pagan cultures, but not even mentioning their highest deities, just calling them the greater and the lesser light, these things that God just casually put there to serve a purpose. But another thing I want you to notice in this passage is another poetic style is the beauty in how the creation account aligns. For example, day 1 is done in preparation for day 4. Day 2 in preparation for day 5, day 3 in preparation for day 6. And what we read in verse 2, the earth was formless and void, that's basically the outline for the whole Genesis chapter 1. The earth was formless. So in day 1 and day 2 and day 3, God gave it form. And it was void, it was empty. And so in day 4 and day 5 and day 6, God filled it. Isn't that magnificent? Isn't it so beautiful? And how often do we not just read over these amazing passages? And so Genesis chapter 1 is designed to be a type of mirror where the one side of the week reflects or points to the other side of the week. Again, I just want to add, and I want to say on this point, that this in no way negates the historicity of the Genesis narrative. Some would look at the poetry and say, well, obviously it must be interpreted as poetry, meaning symbolically or allegorically, because it's so perfectly written as poetry. But I would argue against that, because our God is a creative God. And as I mentioned, if you were here when we preached on Revelation chapter 12, I pointed out many times where God uses irony to accomplish his purposes. For example, Pharaoh gives the commandment that the Hebrew boys must be thrown into the river in order to kill them. And then what happens? One of them is taken from the river and he destroys Pharaoh. We see that Abraham and Sarah, who are far outside the age of bearing children, not only are given a child, but a nation is born from them. We see Jesus being crushed to death, being murdered, and God using that as a way and as a means of our salvation. The way, the means of our salvation. So right through the Bible, right through history, we see God working in a poetic fashion. And it starts at the very beginning, where God just shows his perfect creativity. Another thing that I quickly want to draw your attention to is this concept of a day. Now, there's much debate about this day, and it was the first day, and the second day, and the third day. Some say that these days are long periods of time, spanning millions, if not hundreds of millions or billions of years. Some say they refer to ages. Or some would even say that they refer to stages of evolution or the way that the creation was formed. But this is not the case. And we know this simply by the usage of the Hebrew word for day. The Hebrew word yom simply refers to a 24-hour day. There's many other words the writer could have used if he wanted to refer to anything else. But also, if we look at another passage that points us to Genesis, and in actuality actually interprets Genesis chapter 1 for us, Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any works, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You see, even later it's interpreted that the Genesis account was literal days. It's because of that we have 7 days in a week. And so these do not refer to periods of times. Also, this is emphasized by the fact that every single day, a passage of a day is closed with the words, and it was evening, and it was morning. It's almost as if the writer and God himself, foreseeing what people will do in the future, it's just like placing like everything in bold marks. These are literal days. Don't interpret it as anything else. Another thing I want to quickly point your attention to is in Genesis chapter 1, we have the temple motif. We sang in one of our songs that the heavens are the tabernacle of God. The heavens belong to God. And so in Genesis chapter 1, we have that exact same temple motif that we see in the rest of the Old Testament. For example, the earth was created in creation spans 7 days. Everything was created in 6. God rested on the 7th. And as you know, the 7th day is a very important and symbolic number to the ancient and even today Jewish people. And so if we look at what happened in Exodus, we see that the construction of the tabernacle was completed in 7 stages. We also see that the ordination for a priest was 7 days. We see in Solomon's temple that it was constructed in 7 years, and it was dedicated to God in a festival lasting 7 days on the 7th month. And Solomon's dedication speech was given in 7 petitions. And so what we see in Genesis chapter 1 with this idea of the 7 days is not just that God has decided this is how he's going to do it, but it's almost foreshadowing, pointing us to all these other Old Testament and then later New Testament passages where God clearly emphasizes that creation, he has decided to make creation his dwelling place. He is hovering, he is cuddling, he is involved. It is where he has decided to make known his glory. Charles Spurgeon said that creation is the theater in which God displays his glory. And that is an amazing truth. Another thing I want to draw your attention to with regards to the poetic style is, as mentioned, the reference to the sun and moon. The sun and moon are not explicitly mentioned in day 4, only called the greater and the lesser light, in order to take away any credit that can be robbed by these false and pagan worshippers. So, what do we learn then here about God in Genesis chapter 1? Well, we learn a lot of things about God just in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We learn that God is a God of order. He's a God of order, not a God of chaos. He is the creator. We learn that he is powerful and that he is the owner of everything. That he is the life giver. We learn that he is intelligent. To think that it is from the mind of God that we cannot even yet work out how our brains work and how atoms function and quantum mechanics and physics. We are still breaking our brains trying to figure these things out, and God simply created it. He is intelligent. We see that he is a giver. He gives the fish and the birds and the land creatures. We also see that God is a blesser. In 2 times in the passage, he blesses. He blesses the animals, and then he blesses Adam and Eve, the man and woman that was created. God is a blesser. He is a God who loves to give. We also see that He's a worker. Our God is a worker. He's not lazy or does things half-heartedly. He is a worker. He's also a rester. Does He rest because He's tired or it's needed? No, but out of example to us. God is a purpose giver, and we'll take a look at that more next time. He's a purpose giver, but then ultimately He is good. Every single time in the passage we read, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And then on the sixth day it was very good when Adam and Eve were created. And so quickly closing, and I know my time is running out. Quickly, just in closing, I will just to whet your appetite for what lays ahead. We see in this passage that creation is good. But why is it not perfect? The Hebrew had a word for perfect. In fact, that word's used many times in the Old Testament. Why good and not perfect? Well, let's take a look at some few observations. As mentioned, the Hebrew has the word for perfect, but they don't use it. They use the word good. God said it was good. Also, if everything was perfect, why did God then create man to then now work in the garden? To cultivate it. You see, the words used with regards to man is to have dominion, to subdue, to work, or to till the ground. All of these words have a connotation of taking something and making it better, improving upon it. The word till, actually better translated is to serve the ground, to make it fruitful. So if everything was perfect, God would have no need for us to make things better, to cultivate and work the garden and the ground. This indicates us to man's purpose. We are to, in essence, make creation useful. That is what we are put here to do. We are, in essence, almost made to improve upon creation. And this is not a foreign idea. God created man. He created everything, and now He creates man to now come alongside Him and work on this thing called creation. But we have a New Testament equivalent of this as well. Matthew 28, verse 18 to 20. Go therefore and make disciples. I am with you always. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Does Jesus need us to make disciples? I'm pretty sure the angels will do a much better job at evangelizing people than we ever could. Yet, He has partnered with us in this great commission. And it's the same that we see in Genesis chapter 1 when Adam and Eve are created and their mandate is given to them. God created humanity to now work with Him in this act of creation. So creation was good. And at the end of every day, it was good. And after humanity was created on the sixth day, it was very good, but not perfect. Also, just another observation. Did you notice that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is in the garden before the fall of Genesis 3? Meaning that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was good. It's good that God created the tree. It would not have been very good if the knowledge if that tree in itself had any embodiment of sin or evil in it. And I'll expand on this just now as well. Also, notice if we look at Genesis chapter 2, where was this tree placed? In the middle of the garden by the tree of life. Also, it says, when Eve saw the tree, it delighted the eyes. It's literally translated, it's a lust for the eyes. It's so beautiful. This tree was so beautiful that God decided to place it right in the middle and tell them not to eat of it. Also, Genesis 2, verse 17, God says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now, in our English translations, and Afrikaans as well, it's easy to read that just as a warning. But in fact, it's not just a warning. In essence, it's written almost as a prophecy. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Also, when they now eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what does God say about them? Remember in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and this is very interesting. Genesis 1, verse 26, God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. That's the purpose. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. Adam and Eve then eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then what happens? After that, Genesis chapter 3, verse 22. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now let Leslie reach his hand out and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. This concept of the knowledge of good and evil is not in itself evil, because God knows of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's interesting that Genesis chapter 1, let us make man in our image, and then Genesis chapter 3, they are now like us, and so let's put them out of the garden. What does all of this mean? It's interesting, if you read Revelation, what happens at the end of the book of Revelation? Revelation chapter 22. You see the tree of life appear again in the city of Jerusalem, in the middle. But there's no tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not mentioned. It's not mentioned ever again after it was eaten from. But the tree of life is mentioned again later. So, what's going on? Well, for that, you need to come back on the 6th of March to find out. And so, quickly in closing, application. Creation is a theater for God to display His glory in. We are happiest when we fulfill our God-given purpose. We are closely tied to nature, and we will look at that next week as well. Hence, there's a reason why statistically most city dwellers suffer the most from depression compared to people who live in the country. We are closely connected with creation. We are made to work alongside God, not just in improving creation and cultivating it and making it useful, but also in the New Testament sense with the Great Commission. We are given this great privilege to work alongside God. Also, we are to be stewards of creation. We are to make the best use of creation. And again, we'll look at that next week. We are to till the ground, to serve it. Another application is never argue the existence of God. Everyone knows of the existence of God. God does not believe in atheists. Simply preach the gospel. The gospel will confront their consciences. Another application simply is appreciate your Bibles. Beware of the text, and beware that passages that we often read, that they don't lose their meaning and deepness simply because we're more aware of them. Another application is that we are designed to work. And we'll look at that next time as well. We are designed to work. We are given the command to work the earth before the fall in Genesis 3. What happens after it? Our work is just made more difficult. Also, what do we now see? Jumping ahead a bit. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and they're placed outside the garden. Adam and Eve was made to protect and to serve the garden. But after they sinned, the garden needed to be protected from them. God placed them outside, and He put an angel there to keep them from entering the garden. And so, ever since our first parents, Adam and Eve, were placed outside the garden, humanity has had an internal craving to return to paradise. Where do you think all these utopian ideologies come from? Communism and socialism. And it doesn't matter how many times and how many hundreds of millions of people have died, this time we'll do it better. Because we have an urging, we have a craving to return to paradise, to where we were kicked out of. But what does Jesus tell us? What did Jesus say to the thief who professed faith in Him? Today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus is our gateway, the door, the road to paradise. And right now, paradise is in heaven, a different realm, a different dimension. But one day, paradise will return to earth, and everything will be made new. And that is what we have to look forward to. But only for those who place their faith in Christ. You see, what we read in the beginning, in Colossians chapter 1, it was Christ in Genesis chapter 1. It was Him who created all things by Him and for Him and through Him, and all things are to Him. It is to Him. He is the first and the last. Everything is about Him. All of history points to the cross, to Christ. Let us look to Him. Let us hold fast to Him, so that we will one day receive paradise. And so much more can be said. What about the Sabbath? What about our roles and purposes? What about our relationship about God? What about the human to human and God to creation and God to human relationships? What about the fall of Satan? Why a snake? A snake of all animals. What about the phrase, let us make man in our image, about the plural? What about all those things? Well, for that, as mentioned, you'll have to return next month. Let's pray. Lord, we are so thankful to you. And Lord, I'm thankful for everyone who's here and their patience in listening now. And Lord, I'm thankful for this amazing book. And Lord, I pray that you would work in our hearts, that you would bless us with this passage. Make us see your magnificence, your glory, and your awesomeness. Let us bow down and worship. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.